target. Truman and Stimson are acting like the bomb is going to be dropped on a military base or an airfield or something, and then patting themselves on the back for not dropping it on civilians. For whatever reason, Truman is thinking about the bomb as though it is only going to affect enemy soldiers. He seems to understand that it would be wrong to drop the bomb on civilians, but not that that is exactly what is about to happen. As for why this is, there are 3 possible explanations that I can imagine. The first is that Truman genuinely thinks the bomb is not going to be dropped on civilians and that the target list only includes military bases or something. In this version of events, Truman is told by Stimson that the bomb is going to be dropped on a purely military target, believes him, and is later surprised by the fact the bombs have actually been dropped on civilians, and so he orders that no more nuclear bombs should be dropped without his express permission, which is something he did do after the second bomb was dropped, by the way. Then I guess he realizes that he's massively screwed up, but decides to just run with it and pretend that was the plan all along, because that's easier at that point than admitting the enormous incompetence and being like, sorry, I didn't actually mean to blow up 2 cities, that's my bad. The second explanation is that Truman is simply deluding himself. He knows exactly what the target is, but he's convincing himself it's something else. If he really thought about it, he'd know that the bomb was not going to land on a purely military target, so he's not thinking about it, and he's deceiving himself. The third explanation I can imagine is that Truman is just consciously lying. He knows the bomb is not going to be dropped on a purely military target, but he's falsely claiming that that is what he believes at this point in time. And I suppose this could have been done with an eye on his place in the history books, or to protect himself if there was any significant repercussions after the bombs. Then he could have pointed to this and claimed, hey, I ordered them to be dropped on military targets, you can't pin this on me. All these options are just speculation on my part, however. If I was forced to guess, I'd say he was probably deceiving himself, but I do not know the actual reason why Truman wrote that the bombs were only going to be used on military targets. I only know that for whatever reason, when he wrote that, he was wrong. Now, leaving the nuclear bombs to the side for a moment, I wouldn't blame someone for asking at this point. If Truman and Burns are apparently so anxious to get the war over with before the Russians get involved, and they knew at Potsdam that the Emperor was asking for peace, why was peace not able to be negotiated sooner than it was? Why, when they heard the Emperor wanted peace, did they not simply send him a message saying, great, okay, let's negotiate peace? And the answer to that is the deadlock over unconditional surrender. As we know, Japan was committed to avoiding an unconditional surrender. But Truman was likewise committed to securing one. He didn't want to accept what the Japanese were offering, which was a negotiated peace. He wanted a full unconditional surrender. Now, various individuals within the Allied governments and armed forces understood that insisting on absolute unconditional surrender was, particularly with regards to the question of the Emperor, going to cause problems and possibly prolong the war. While at the Yalta Conference, Winston Churchill suggested that mitigating the terms of surrender, quote, would be worthwhile if it led to the saving of a year or a year and a half of war in which so much blood and treasure would be poured out. But President Roosevelt was unreceptive to Churchill's suggestion. Not to be deterred, however, Churchill tried again when talking to Truman at Potsdam, and he later gave an account of the conversation. I dwelt upon the tremendous cost in American life and to a smaller extent in British life which would be involved in forcing unconditional surrender upon the Japanese. It was for him to consider whether this might not be expressed in some other way, so that we got all the essentials for future peace and security, and yet left the Japanese some show of saving their military honour and some assurance of their national existence. However, Churchill found this president as unreceptive as the last. Truman, quote, countered by saying that he did not think the Japanese had any military honour after Pearl Harbor, but Churchill responded that, at any rate, they had something for which they were ready to face certain death in very large numbers, and this might not be so important to us as to them. Others attempted to influence Truman on the unconditional surrender issue at various times, sometimes seemingly having more luck than Churchill there. Under-Secretary of State Joseph Grew, who understood the importance of the emperor having been US ambassador to Japan for a decade, advised Truman
78, and it was intensely nationalistic. The rest of Europe looked at Serbia suspiciously, though, and its catchphrase, "Where dwells a Serb, there is Serbia." Well, you can see how that didn't sit well with a lot of people, and let's face it, the only way for Serbia to have united the southern Slav peoples would have been to bring down Austria-Hungary for good, which would have taken a war, which is kind of what happened. Fewer than 5 million people lived in Serbia, though, so all intentions aside, that wasn't going to happen by itself. However, in the search for allies, Serbia alienated a lot of Europe by the brutal and often violent repression of its own minority peoples, especially Muslims. In much the same way, Serbs and other minorities were repressed by Austria-Hungary, so they didn't get a whole lot of sympathy. And also, endless Balkan violence was nothing new to people. In fact, it was just one of those things that most Europeans were resigned to reading about in the papers from time to time. Another murder, another bombing, in that far-off corner of Europe where such things just seemed to happen, and regime change was often by murder. Actually, stereotypes aside, the last did happen in 1903. King Alexander and Queen Draga were murdered in their private apartments by a group of young army officers, and their bodies were mutilated. Now, one of the men responsible, Dragutin Dimitrovic, became a national hero when he was wounded by royal guards. He was also known simply as Opis, and had been a founding member and leader of the Black Hand, who organized the hit on the king and queen. The Black Hand. You just sort of know from the name that these guys aren't going to be devoted to, you know, starting soup kitchens or maintaining city parks. Anyhow, by the beginning of the First World War, there were thousands of members of the Black Hand, many of them Serbian army officers and even government officials. And this secret organization did pretty much what you would expect of a terrorist organization: plan political murders, train and equip guerrillas, and so forth. And they, and Serbian nationalist goals in general, had a big boost in 1912 and 1913 from the two Balkan Wars, which I'm going to tell you about right now. Okay, not right now, because to talk about the Balkan Wars, I first have to talk about the Moroccan crises. Now, there were two of these, one in 1905 and one in 1911, and you can look them up for details. But what they very basically and very generally involved was the Kaiser trying to drive a wedge between England and France, and hopefully even form an alliance between Germany and England. But they succeeded in doing the opposite, and made the alliance between France and Britain stronger than ever, and drove a deeper wedge between them and Germany. Another result was that France took control of Morocco. Now, at the time, Britain had Egypt, right? So what happens next is very important. Italy saw Ottoman land being seemingly handed out and thought, I gotta get me some of that. So Italy went to war. Now, because of all the Moroccan foolishness, Italy figured, correctly, that England, France, and Germany would do nothing to stop her. So she attacked the Ottoman Empire. The war lasted less than a month, and Italy successfully took Libya. And the dominoes start to fall. The Balkan states, seeing how easily the weakest of the powers could beat the Ottoman Empire, got together and attacked in the First Balkan War. Serbia, Montenegro, Greece, and Bulgaria, with Russian influence, formed the Balkan League, and together succeeded in driving the Ottomans out of the Balkans entirely for the first time in 500 years. It was a big loss for the Ottomans. However, 1 month after the war, Bulgaria, unsatisfied with the way the conquered territories were split up, turned around and attacked Serbia and Greece. The side note here, Serbia occupied Albania in the Second Balkan War and finally had a seaport of her own, but Austria issued an ultimatum to remove all Serbian forces from Albania within 8 days. Serbia complied. Now, as you may guess, this was all a complete mess, and here are some important results. Serbia pretty much doubled her territory in the Balkan Wars, even without Albania, and if you asked a Serb in early 1914, they'd probably say that wars seem to work out pretty well for them, but they pay a terrible price in the end. Between 1912 and 1918, 1 out of every 6 Serbs, men, women, and children, would die violently. After the collapse of the Balkan League and Russia's clearly pro-Serbian position in the Second War, Russia was left with only Serbia as an ally in the entire area. And Russia really wouldn't have much choice but to unconditionally support Serbia in 1914. Both Austria-Hungary and Germany were worried by Serbia's growth in both size and stature. And since a lot of German-speaking people saw Serbia as a Russian satellite, well, Austria was ready and willing to put its foot down on Serbian growth and Slavic nationalism. At the same time, after losing a war to Japan in 1905 and being unable to prevent the Bosnian annexation in 1908, the Tsar in Russia was willing and ready to put his foot down to prevent any further loss of face for Russia. And that's where we were in June 1914. All of these sides playing off one against the other, and at the epicenter of it all, in the Balkans, an organization that used terrorism and political murder to try and achieve its goals. And then Franz Ferdinand went to Sarajevo. If you missed our Prelude to War special number 1, you can click here and watch it right now. You can also check out our other social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter in the info box below for more information about the Great War. As any schoolboy or schoolgirl knows, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914, was the match that touched off the conflagration of World War I. My name is Indy Nidell, and this channel, The Great War, follows World War I week by week exactly 100 years later.